November 1946. 6 hitmen drove into Harlem. 3 cars. No bodies were ever found, only blood thinned by rain and engines still running at 138th and Lenox. The humiliation crushed Ferraro harder than any bullet. To understand how Bumpy Johnson turned a death sentence into a ghost story, go back to the night the first envelope arrived. The rain that fell on Harlem that November was not the kind that cleaned anything. It was cold, dirty rain. The kind that turned the gutters black and made the sidewalks smell like wet concrete and something older underneath engine oil. Rotting wood. 40 years of the same neighborhood grinding against itself. It came down in sheets across Lenox Avenue and hammered the tin awnings above the shops until the sound was like something being beaten slowly to death. Inside the back room of the Lenox Lounge, none of that mattered. The walls were thick enough to swallow the street. The air was bourbon and cigarettes, and the particular smell of men who had been making violent decisions for so long that danger had stopped registering as a feeling and become simply a condition of existence, like hunger, like cold, like the constant low pressure behind the eyes that never fully went away. Bumpy Johnson sat at a table in the corner with nothing in front of him. No cards, no drink, no newspaper, just a white envelope that a boy had placed there and vanished before anyone thought to ask his name. Junie Bird stood by the door with his arms folded and his face doing the thing it did when he was afraid but had decided not to show it. He had been Bumpy's right hand since 1942. He knew every block, every bartender, every back staircase in this neighborhood. He was watching Bumpy the way a man watches a match held close to a fuse. Bumpy looked at the envelope for a long time without touching it. Then he picked it up, turned it over. No name, no stamp, no postmark, nothing. He opened it with one clean motion, the way a surgeon opens a body, precise, deliberate, without hesitation. Inside, resting on a square of black velvet, was a single bullet, polished, brass-cased, the kind of detail that took time to arrange, which meant whoever sent it had wanted him to understand that this was not impulse. This was a decision. This was a man who had sat somewhere quiet and thought carefully about what message to send, and then sent it with patience. Bumpy set the bullet on the table. He did not touch it again. He reached for the glass of rye that Junie had poured 20 minutes earlier and finished it in one swallow. His face showed nothing. His hand was completely steady. Then he said, quietly, "Lock every money route out of Harlem. Tonight. Nothing moves until I say." Junie pushed off from the wall. Every route. Every single one. The next morning, Bumpy sat across from Elise in her kitchen on 131st Street while she made coffee that smelled like burned tar and tasted like it too. Elise ran the numbers operation out of a laundromat 2 doors down and had been doing it since before most of Bumpy's men were born. She was 62 years old, with gray hair pulled back so tight it seemed to be holding her face together. She had survived everything Harlem had thrown at her by knowing one thing better than anyone else: where money went. She listened to Junie describe the envelope, the velvet, the bullet, the timing. She didn't speak for a moment. She just poured her coffee and held the cup with both hands and stared at the table. Then she said, "That's not Brooklyn. Brooklyn sends bodies, not theater. This is somebody who thinks he's smarter than he is." She opened a ledger, not the public one, and ran her finger down a column of handwritten figures. Her finger stopped. She tapped the page twice. "Payment through the Marotta channel. 2 weeks ago. That channel has been dead since August. Somebody turned it back on." Sal Marotta. The name dropped into the room and nobody needed to say anything else for a moment. Sal was an Italian-American fixer who operated out of a social club in East Harlem, a man made entirely of middle positions, smiling from both sides of every transaction, trusted by no one completely, and used by everyone constantly. He smiled before he spoke, which was a habit that people who didn't know him thought was charm, and people who did know him understood as preparation. He was not dangerous with his hands. He was dangerous because he knew which hands to hire. Bumpy did not go to Sal that day, or the next 3. He let the money routes stay locked. He let the pressure build. Somewhere out there, someone had expected a reaction. Fear. Retreat. A phone call begging for terms and received nothing but silence instead. On the 5th day, Bumpy sent word through a neutral party that he wanted to discuss a business opportunity with Sal. An expansion. New territory. New margins. A chance to make serious money. Politely worded. Professionally delivered. Sal responded within 40 minutes, which told Bumpy more than Sal intended to tell him. Innocent men take their time. Men who are waiting for something answer fast. What Bumpy did not say to anyone was what he had felt in the exact moment he opened that envelope and saw the bullet on the black velvet. He had not felt fear. He had felt something cold and very clear move through him, the specific, clarifying fury of a man who has spent 2 decades building something from nothing and is now watching someone who built nothing reach for it with clean hands and an easy smile. He had felt it before. He knew what it required. Not noise, not speed, patience cold, deliberate, merciless patience, the kind that waits until the other man believes he has already won. The bullet stayed on the table in the back room all week. He left it there on purpose. Some of his men glanced at it and looked away. None of them asked about it. They understood what it meant without being told someone had made a declaration, and the man they worked for had received it without blinking. That was the message Bumpy needed them to carry back to the street. Historians and journalists who've pieced together this era note that the oral record of Harlem's underground is often more precise than the official one. Police files from this period were incomplete by design, and many men involved kept no records at all. In that world, the first bullet was rarely sent to kill a man. It was sent to measure how much his fear weighed. Whoever sent this one was about to find out they had miscalculated the scale. By Tuesday, the whole neighborhood knew something was wrong and nobody was saying it out loud. That was how Harlem worked. Information didn't travel in straight lines. It moved sideways, through silence and half sentences and the way a man's eyes shifted when a certain name came up in conversation. It lived in the extra second before a bartender answered a question, in the way the numbers runners on 125th took longer routes than usual, in the way the women at the beauty parlor on 7th Avenue lowered their voices without being asked. Nobody announced anything. Nobody needed to. The neighborhood read itself like a body reads pain, not through thought, but through instinct, through the accumulated knowledge of years of living somewhere that punished ignorance with violence. May Carter read it faster than anyone. Mabel Carter was not Bumpy's wife or his girlfriend. She was harder to replace than either. She managed his public presence the way a general manages terrain, knowing which ground to hold, which to yield, and which appearances, made at exactly the right moment, could shift an entire situation without a single shot fired. She was 54 years old, dressed always in clothes that cost real money, and she understood that in a neighborhood running on reputation, the story people told about you was sometimes more powerful than anything you actually did. She found Bumpy at his regular table at the diner on 7th Avenue on Tuesday afternoon, and sat down without waiting to be invited. "They're saying you've gone to ground," she said. No preamble, no softening. "Who's saying it?" "Everyone who hasn't seen you in 4 days, which is everyone." Bumpy looked at her steadily. "And what do they think it means?" "That you're scared." She said it flat. Clinical. The way a doctor says something is infected, and if people believe the man running this neighborhood is scared, they start making other arrangements, first small ones, then bigger ones, and by the time you come back out into the street, half of what you built will have already started moving toward whoever they think is going to win. This was the reality of power in Harlem in 1946, and Bumpy knew it as well as any man alive. A gun could hold a block. Presence held a neighborhood. The moment visibility disappeared, the stories filled in the space where the man used to be, and stories were harder to correct than bullet wounds. That evening, Bumpy put on his gray suit, the good one, the one May had pressed herself without being asked, and walked into the Savoy ballroom at 9 o'clock with no bodyguard, no crew, no visible protection of any kind. Just a man in a good suit on a Tuesday night, moving through a room like he owned it, because he did. He walked slowly, greeted people by name, shook hands with an alderman, laughed at something a trumpet player said, loud enough for the tables around them to hear. He stood at the bar for 20 minutes, holding a drink he barely touched, and let the room see him the way the room needed to see him, unhurried, unafraid, completely at ease in a place where anyone who wanted him dead could theoretically walk through the front door. He stayed 45 minutes. Then he left. What the room didn't know, what nobody except Red Tommy and 2 other men knew, was that every entrance of the Savoy had been covered from the outside since 8:30. Red Tommy had spent the previous day repositioning men to shadow every public appearance Bumpy planned that week. Red Tommy was a cargo runner who had worked Brooklyn logistics before switching sides, and he understood how outside crews operated in unfamiliar neighborhoods. They moved in pairs. They needed clean exits. They avoided blocks near precincts. They always underestimated how many eyes were watching in a black neighborhood that had learned, through decades of necessity, to see everything and record nothing officially. They'll send at least 4, Red Tommy had told Bumpy. Probably 6. 2 vehicles. They'll do a walkthrough first, maybe 24 hours before. Then we identify them on the walkthrough, Bumpy said, if they're careless. Men who think this is easy are always careless. Father Owens had seen one of them. The priest at St. Charles on 141st Street had been in Harlem since 1925 and had heard confessions that would have ended careers and freed prisoners and destroyed families if he had been a different kind of man. He kept everything he heard inside the sealed vault of his own conscience and helped the people the streets broke without asking how they got broken. But he paid close attention to his neighborhood, because he had found that attention was the only gift he could reliably offer a community that had mostly concluded God wasn't paying close attention to it. He told Bumpy. When Bumpy stopped by Wednesday morning with a donation envelope and a reason to be seen on neutral ground, that a man he didn't recognize had been walking the block north of the church on Monday afternoon, asking questions. What kind of questions? The kind that circle what they want without naming it. He asked who owned the corner building, asked if it was quiet at night, asked about parking. Did he look like a man thinking about moving to the neighborhood? Father Owens looked at him with 21 years of patient, undisguised honesty. He looked like a man planning to leave it quickly. The calm Bumpy performed that week, the Savoy, the diner, the church visit, the unhurried presence on streets where he was easy to find, did exactly what it was designed to do. A man who was frightened disappeared. A man who was not frightened, or appeared not to be, presented a problem that required a different solution. Threats hadn't moved him. Surveillance hadn't rattled him. The only option left was to send people, and sending people required committing to a plan. And committing to a plan meant making a mistake somewhere that a patient man could find and use. Bumpy was the most patient man in Harlem. He had been practicing his whole life, Veterans who documented street life in this era noted that the power structures running Harlem's underground rarely appeared in official records. What survived was carried in the memories of the people who lived inside it. Power is not always the iron door locked against what's coming. Sometimes it is the open street, the lit window, the man walking slowly and without fear, forcing the enemy to reveal himself before he is ready. The restaurant on Pleasant Avenue had no name on the door and didn't need one. It smelled like garlic cooked in good butter, red wine breathing in open bottles, and the specific combination of old wood and secrecy that builds up over years in rooms where dangerous men have been careful. The walls were deep red, almost brown, the color of dried blood in certain light. The tables were heavy and spaced far apart. The lighting was kept low enough that you could see the person across from you clearly, and the person 2 tables away not at all. It was the kind of place designed to make a man feel comfortable and surveilled simultaneously. Which was the point: comfort loosened mouths. And the men who owned this room preferred loose mouths to closed ones. Bumpy arrived at 8:15. He chose the chair facing the door. He ordered water, not wine, and waited. Sal Marotta walked in at 8:30, dressed in a suit that cost serious money, and carrying the physical ease of a man who had never personally absorbed the consequences of any decision he had ever made. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with a tan that belonged on a yacht rather than an East Harlem social club. He smiled the moment he cleared the doorway before he reached the table. Before eye contact, before any exchange had occurred. The smile of a man who rehearsed conversations in advance and wanted you to believe he hadn't. "Bumpy," he said, warm as a furnace. "Good to see you. Sit down." "Sal." They ate for the first 10 minutes without discussing anything that mattered. The lamb came out braised dark and smelling of rosemary and something smoky underneath. The bread was hot. The wine that Sal poured for himself was good enough that not drinking it was its own statement, and Bumpy didn't touch his glass. They talked about the weather turning cold, about a boxer from the Bronx who had won something, about nothing. The way men talk about nothing when they are actually talking about everything. Then Bumpy set his fork down and said, "I've been looking at the West Side Pharmaceutical Distribution Channel. It's bleeding margin at every handoff. Too many people with their hands out. Not enough volume to justify the exposure. I want to consolidate the middle position." He paused exactly 1 beat. "I think your operation is the right fit." He watched Sal's face. He watched the controlled interest try to suppress the immediate excitement and mostly succeed. He watched the calculation happen, the man running the numbers, adding the percentages, seeing what a consolidated middle position in a restructured distribution channel would mean for his operation, his income, his standing. It was a real offer. It was also large enough to be irresistible to a man who had spent 30 years in the dangerous middle, always dependent on the tolerance of larger powers on both sides. The trap was invisible to Sal, because the trap was built from what Sal chose not to ask. Elise had confirmed the Marotta channel had been dormant since August and reactivated 2 weeks ago. A man with clean hands would have asked, when presented with a new business offer, "Why now? Why come to me now after months of nothing?" The fact that Sal didn't ask meant Sal already knew why now. Sal knew the channel had been reactivated. Sal knew who reactivated it. Sal knew what the money that moved through it had been used for. He accepted the offer in principle within 4 minutes of it being presented. Then he said, carefully, as though it was an afterthought, "You'd want to clear a restructuring like this with the other interested parties. There are people who would want to know about any changes to that channel." Other interested parties. Not a name. A shape. The language of a man acknowledging the existence of someone he was afraid to identify directly. Even here, even now. even in a private room with no witnesses and no recording equipment, and a man across the table who already knew most of it anyway. "There's always someone who wants to know," Bumpy said. His voice was completely level. "That's why I have conversations first. No surprises." Sal smiled and reached for his wine. The meal continued. The lamb was extraordinary. The conversation moved to other things. By the time the espresso arrived, Bumpy had what he came for. Not a name, but something more useful. He had the outline of a man. Patient. Careful. Operating through intermediaries. Somebody Sal Marotta, who feared very little and respected even less, would not name out loud even in a sealed room. That level of fear pointed in one direction, driving home through Harlem at 11. Windows down. The city coming in from both sides. Music bleeding from the club doors. Voices bouncing off the brownstones. The smell of fried food and cold air, and the particular living smell of a neighborhood that never fully slept. Bumpy thought about the kind of man who sent a bullet on black velvet instead of just sending men. A man who wanted the target to feel it coming. A man who enjoyed the architecture of intimidation. That was a man who had never been on the receiving end of it. That was about to change. The events of this period were never officially documented. What's known comes from those who witnessed it and lived long enough to talk. Years after the danger had passed and the men involved were beyond the reach of any courtroom. At the table of men who rule the night streets, the knife is never in the sleeve. It sits inside the offer that sounds most reasonable, patient, polished, and already pointed at your throat before you finish saying yes. The silence before a storm doesn't sound like silence. It sounds like everything holding its breath at the same time. Harlem that Wednesday night was exactly that kind of quiet. The usual sounds were still there. Music from the clubs. Somebody arguing 2 floors up. A car horn on 7th Avenue, but underneath all of it was something compressed and waiting. The way air feels before lightning splits it open. The men on Bumpy's payroll felt it in their chests without being able to name it. They moved a little faster. They checked their backs a little more. They laughed a little less. Junie Bird came through the back door of the Lenox at 11:15 with a torn ledger page folded into his jacket pocket and the face of a man who had seen something he wished he could unsee. He sat down across from Bumpy and put the page on the table without speaking. Bumpy looked at it. Column of figures, handwritten. Some entries circled in pencil by someone who had been in a hurry. 3 recurring payments over 6 weeks. Each one routed through a different name. Each one landing in the same place if you followed the chain far enough. The amounts were not large. That was the part that made it worse. Whoever was selling information wasn't getting rich off it. They were doing it for what amounted to walking around money, which meant they had either been compromised through debt or fear rather than greed, or they had hated Bumpy long enough that the money was almost beside the point. Elise had found it. She'd been pulling receipts for 3 days straight, cross-referencing payment dates against the timeline of incidents the walk-through Father Owens witnessed. The moment the Marotta channel reactivated. The night the envelope arrived. The pattern was there once you knew to look for it. The payments always came 2 or 3 days before something moved. "Who does this trail end at?" Bumpy asked. Junie looked at the table. Not at Bumpy. At the table. That told Bumpy everything before a single word was spoken. "Say the name," Bumpy said. "Eddie," Junie said. The word came out flat and quiet, like something dropped from a height. Eddie Cole had been with Bumpy since 1939. He wasn't a soldier, and he wasn't management. He was something harder to replace. The kind of man who existed in the space between those categories. He knew schedules. He knew routes. He knew which meetings happened where and what time Bumpy moved between locations and which car he used on which days. He'd been trusted with the kind of operational knowledge that could get a man killed if it reached the wrong ears because it had been earned over 7 years of being present, reliable, and apparently loyal. Apparently. Bumpy sat with the name for a long time. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He stared at the ledger page and breathed slowly the way a man breathes when he is working to keep something very cold from becoming something very hot. Junie said carefully, "We could move on him tonight." "No." "Bumpy." "No." The word was final. Quiet. Cold as the bullet that started all of this. A dead man tells us one story. A live man who thinks he's still trusted tells us everything. This was the decision that separated what happened next from what could have happened. Any other man would have moved immediately. The rage demanded it. The insult demanded it. 7 years of shared meals and shared risks and shared secrets demanding a response that matched the scale of the betrayal. But Bumpy understood something about information that most men in his position never learned. The source is only valuable until the enemy knows you found it. The moment Eddie disappeared or turned up dead, Ferraro would know the channel was burned, and the operation would adapt. The 6 men would come from a different direction, at a different time, through an approach that hadn't been anticipated. Keep Eddie alive. Keep Eddie in place. Keep Eddie feeding exactly what Bumpy wanted Ferraro to believe. "He thinks he's invisible," Bumpy said. "We're going to let him stay invisible. And we're going to give him something very specific to report." He set up the trap over the next 4 days with the patience of a man who has decided that patience is the most savage weapon available to him. A fake route was established, specific streets, specific timing, 1 car, no visible protection. A fake meeting was scheduled at a location that offered exactly the kind of approach an outside crew would want: narrow entry, clear sight lines, limited foot traffic after midnight. The details were fed to Eddie through conversations he was allowed to overhear, through schedule information left where he could find it, through the ordinary operational flow of a man who suspected nothing. Elise watched the payment cycle. 48 hours after the fake route was established, money moved through the Maratha channel again. Small amount, routine transfer, invisible to anyone not looking for it. Bumpy read the confirmation and said nothing for a full minute. Then he said to Junie, "They'll come Thursday night." Junie looked at him. "How many?" "6, Bumpy said. "Ferraro doesn't do anything halfway." The weight of what Eddie had done settled into the room like smoke settling after a fire, slowly, completely, reaching into every corner. Junie had known Eddie since before the war. They'd eaten together, worked together, covered for each other in situations where covering meant the difference between walking out and being carried out. The betrayal didn't just break trust in one man. It broke something in the architecture of how the whole operation understood itself. Bumpy read that on Junie's face and said, "This is why you never trust completely. Not me. Not anyone. You trust what people do when they think no one is watching. Everything else is a story they're telling you." Later, people who knew the story would say that Eddie cried when he was finally confronted, that he collapsed, that he begged, that the man who had spent years being dependable finally broke into pieces in front of the people he'd sold out. Maybe that's true. Stories always acquire tears after the blood has dried. What mattered was simpler and more brutal than any of that. Street historians who worked to preserve Harlem's underground record noted that the figures involved rarely left written evidence. Accounts like this one are drawn from the people who were present and survived to speak about it decades later. Empires don't fall because the enemy is at the gate. They fall when the man holding the keys has already sold the sound of the lock. Thursday came in cold and damp, the kind of November night that turned breath to vapor and made every alley look like the inside of something dead. By 9 in the evening, Harlem streets had thinned out the way they always did when the temperature dropped hard. The stoop-sitters had gone inside. The corner men had pulled back. The foot traffic on Lenox had reduced to people moving with purpose and their heads down. The neighborhood wasn't empty. It was never empty. But the particular kind of stillness that had settled over the blocks around 138th Street was not the ordinary stillness of a cold night. It was the stillness of people who had been quietly told to be somewhere else. Word had moved through the neighborhood without being spoken directly. Father Owens had noticed it that afternoon during a walk that took him past 3 separate locations where men he recognized were either absent or positioned differently than usual. He didn't ask questions. He went back to the church and stayed there and prayed for the people he couldn't protect, which on nights like this felt like everyone. Eddie Cole spent Thursday doing exactly what he had done every Thursday for 7 years. He made his rounds. He checked in with the collection points. He had coffee at the diner on 7th and sat at the counter for 40 minutes reading the newspaper. He moved through Harlem like a man with nothing on his conscience, which was either a performance so practiced it had become indistinguishable from reality, or evidence that some men's capacity for self-justification is deep enough to swallow anything. Bumpy had given him one final piece of information on Wednesday evening, delivered casually. Almost as an afterthought at the end of a routine conversation, he would be moving between locations Thursday night, around midnight, through the alley off 138th. 1 car. Early departure from the club. Light night. Not much going on. Everything Eddie needed. All of it false. Red Tommy drove the car. He hadn't been told all of it. He knew he was running a route. Knew the timing. Knew to drive slowly and without varying the speed. He had worked with Bumpy long enough to understand that when he was given instructions without explanations, the explanations were being kept from him for reasons that would become clear later, or not at all. He drove a dark Buick down 138th at 12 minutes past midnight and turned into the alley at the exact time the schedule specified. And his hands were steady on the wheel the entire time because Red Tommy had made his peace with dangerous work a long time ago, back when Brooklyn taught him what a man was worth if he couldn't hold his nerve. The 6 men came in 2 cars, exactly as Red Tommy had predicted. They parked on opposite ends of the block. They moved in pairs. The way professionals move in pairs, staggered, covering angles, communication through hand signals rather than voices. They were not amateurs. They were men who had done this kind of work before and had survived it because they were methodical and because they didn't underestimate targets. They underestimated this one. What happened next in that alley has never been fully documented, and the men who were there have told it different ways in different years, which is itself a form of answer about what they witnessed. What is certain is this 6 men entered the approach to that alley. The car they were converging on cleared the block and disappeared. And then something happened in the dark at the Harlem end of that block that was swift and total, and left no bodies because Bumpy had specifically ensured there would be bodies. A dead man is a headline. A missing man is a question that never stops being asked. The cars were found where they had been parked, engines cold by the time the first person reported them. Doors unlocked. Nothing inside that identified the men who had driven them. 3 vehicles total, counting the one they'd used for approach surveillance earlier in the evening. They sat on the street through the night and into the following morning like artifacts from an event that hadn't officially occurred. Bumpy was at a table in a club on 125th Street when it was done, sitting with 3 other men, playing cards, visible and accounted for. He had not been anywhere near 138th Street. He had not given a direct order in a room where it could be heard by anyone whose name wasn't already beyond compromise. He had constructed a situation and allowed the situation to resolve itself, which is the most complete form of power, the kind that leaves nothing attached to it. When Junie came in at 1:30 in the morning and sat down without a word, Bumpy looked at his cards and said, Next hand. Junie dealt. 6 versions of that night circulate through Harlem's oral history, all of them starting from the same place: a schedule, a route, a midnight appointment that was never what it appeared to be. The specific details shift depending on who's telling it and what year they're telling it in. That's the nature of history that was never meant to be written down. Much of what is known about these events was passed down through community accounts spanning decades. The official record from this period is deliberately thin, by design on multiple sides. Some nights, power doesn't pull a trigger. It opens a door, lets the other man walk through, and locks it from the outside before he understands what room he's standing in. Friday morning came up gray and cold over Harlem, the sky the color of dirty dishwater, and the neighborhood opened for business the way it always did: the bakeries first, then the newsstands, then the diners with their windows fogged from short-order grills cooking eggs and bacon and toast that smelled like the first honest thing of the day. On the surface, nothing had changed. Underneath the surface, everything had. The small business owners along Lenox and 7th felt it without being able to identify what they were feeling: a slight contraction, a careful quality to the morning's conversations. Men who usually argued loudly about baseball talking instead in lowered voices about nothing in particular. The numbers runners came by later than usual and left faster than usual. 2 collection points that should have been active by 9 were still dark at 11. The phones in certain establishments rang and were answered on the 2nd ring instead of the 5th, which meant the people waiting for calls were sitting close to the phones, which meant they were waiting for news that had not yet arrived. In Brooklyn, the phones were doing something different. Luca Bell, Ferraro's accountant, had been awake since 4 in the morning. He was a thin, precise man who wore the same style of dark suit every day and communicated almost entirely through numbers, debts, assets, projections, losses, because numbers, unlike men, did not lie about what they actually were. He had been tracking a liability since midnight that was growing by the hour into something his ledger had no clean category for. 6 men sent, 0 reports received, 3 vehicles unaccounted for. He called Sal Marotta at 6 in the morning, which was 4 hours earlier than he had ever called anyone in his professional life. Sal answered on the 3rd ring with the voice of a man who had not slept either. "There's nothing," Luca said. Sal was quiet for a moment. "What do you mean, nothing?" "I mean there are no calls, no confirmation, no trouble report, no abort signal, nothing. The vehicles are gone, the men are gone, and nobody on the Harlem side is talking. Not to us, not to our contacts, not to anyone we can reach." The silence that followed was the silence of 2 men understanding simultaneously that the absence of information was itself a very specific kind of information. A failed job produces noise, confusion, panic, someone talking, someone running, a trail of some kind. Bodies produce headlines, police activity, witnesses. Even a partial failure produces something. The complete absence of any signal, any trace, any echo whatsoever meant that whatever had happened had been handled so cleanly and so completely that the men who handled it had chosen, deliberately, to leave no explanation at all. That choice was its own message. Vincent Ferraro understood this when Luca briefed him at 8 that morning. Ferraro was 61 years old, heavy through the chest and shoulders, with a face that had learned over decades to express nothing that could be used against him. He had sent men into difficult situations before. He had lost men before. What he had never experienced before was this: the total erasure of an operation, the complete vanishing of 6 professionals, leaving behind only 3 empty cars and a silence so clean it felt architectural. He sat with it for a long time before he spoke. "He left the cars," Ferraro said finally. "Yes," Luca said. "He left them on purpose." "Yes." Ferraro understood the language. The cars were not evidence of what had happened. They were a statement about what had not happened. No public display. No spectacle. No bodies photographed and printed in the papers. No story that required a response from Ferraro's organization. The cars were a door left slightly open. This can stay quiet if you want it to stay quiet, or it can become something else entirely. May Carter spent Friday afternoon moving through her usual rounds: the beauty parlor, the dress shop on 125th, the afternoon gathering at a church auxiliary meeting where women who knew everything about the neighborhood exchanged information under the cover of discussing charity fundraisers. She said nothing directly. She didn't need to. She mentioned, in the course of ordinary conversation, that she'd heard some out-of-town people had come to Harlem the night before looking for something and left without finding it. She mentioned it once, quietly, and let the room do what rooms full of women with excellent memories always do with a piece of information like that. By Saturday morning, the version circulating through Harlem's network was more dramatic than the truth and more effective than any public statement Bumpy could have made. Nobody knew the specifics. Everybody understood the result. A powerful man from outside had sent his best people into this neighborhood, and those people had dissolved into the November dark without a trace. And the man who ran these streets had spent Friday morning playing cards. The fear that produced was not the fear of violence. It was the fear of something that left no evidence, and that, in the specific psychology of men who lived by force and calculation, was considerably more paralyzing than any number of bodies. Ferraro made a call on Saturday afternoon, not to Sal, directly, to a neutral party both sides trusted, requesting a meeting. Requesting it, not demanding it. The distinction was not lost on anyone who heard about it. Accounts of this period were preserved largely through community memory and the work of researchers who interviewed survivors years after the fact. Gaps in the record reflect how deliberately these events were kept outside of any official documentation. When no one can find the bodies, people imagine the rest themselves, and imagination, in the world these men occupied, was always more brutal than the truth. The tailor shop on 132nd Street smelled like pressed wool, machine oil, and fear that had been sitting in the walls long enough to become part of the building. The front was dark, gate half pulled, one mannequin in the window wearing a jacket nobody had come back to collect. The back room was 4 chairs, a folding table, one bare bulb on a wire swinging slightly from the draft under the door, and 4 men who all understood that what got said in the next hour would determine whether the next month was quiet or catastrophic. Bumpy arrived first. He always arrived first. The man who is already seated when the other man walks in has already won something small and real. And in rooms like this, the small real things accumulated into outcomes. Vincent Ferraro came in at 8 with Luca Bell 1 step behind him, notepad already open, pen already in hand. Ferraro wore a charcoal suit pressed absolutely flat, the kind of flat that requires effort and time and someone paid to care about it. He was 61 years old, heavy through the chest, with a face trained over decades to reveal nothing that could be used as leverage. He looked like a man swallowing something sharp and doing it without changing his expression. Nobody shook hands. Ferraro sat. Luca positioned himself behind and to the right like a piece of furniture that recorded sound. Junie stood in the far corner with his arms folded and the specific jaw set of a man physically restraining himself from saying what he actually thought. "I came because full war serves neither of us," Ferraro said. His voice was flat, businesslike, the voice of a man who had rehearsed not sounding defeated. "That's correct," Bumpy said. "6 of my men are unaccounted for. That's a condition that began with a bullet on black velvet delivered to my table." Bumpy said, "I didn't start the accounting. I just balanced it. The bulb swung slightly. Nobody moved. Ferraro said, "Terms, not a question." The fact that he asked for terms rather than offered them told Bumpy everything about where they actually stood. Regardless of the pressed suit and the controlled face, a man asks for terms when he has already accepted that the other man is holding the pen. Bumpy laid it out clean. Harlem stayed Harlem every operation, every route, every collection point, every person on the payroll, untouched and permanently outside any claim from Brooklyn or anywhere connected to Brooklyn. In exchange, Ferraro received access to a pharmaceutical transit corridor through Upper Manhattan, a real route. Genuinely profitable. Clean enough that his people could operate it without exposure. The arrangement would be announced through Sal as a mutual business deal. Both names attached. Equal billing. Face preserved. Border maintained. The man inside Harlem's network who had fed Ferraro's people information would be handled by Harlem's law. "And my 6 men," Ferraro said. Bumpy looked at him steadily. "Unaccounted for." The same 2 words back. Unchanged. Final. Ferraro understood what lived inside those words. No explanation, no evidence, no body, no story that could be taken to anyone for resolution. 6 men had gone into Harlem and been swallowed by it, and the man across this table was telling him with complete calm that the accounting on those 6 men was closed. Ferraro sat with it. The bulb swung. Luca's pen moved in small, quiet strokes. Then Ferraro said, "I want the corridor announced as a partnership. Equal, public-facing, not charity, not terms of surrender. A business arrangement between 2 operations." Junie shifted in the corner. Bumpy heard it without looking. This was the real negotiation. The money was settled. The territory was settled. What Ferraro needed to carry back to his own men was something with his name on it that didn't read as defeat. A man who returns from a room having given everything and received nothing doesn't stay in his position. Ferraro was buying the story he needed to tell, and the currency he was using was the one thing more valuable than cash in this world: the appearance of standing. Bumpy looked at him for 10 full seconds. "Equal billing through Sal," he said. "Both names on the arrangement. But the moment any person connected to your organization enters Harlem for any purpose other than transit, the announcement becomes the last document that carries your name on anything in this city." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Are we clear on the difference between transit and presence?" Ferraro held his eyes. "We're clear." "Then we're finished." The meeting lasted 51 minutes. Luca closed the notepad. Chairs scraped back. Nobody moved toward the door first for a moment. The specific suspended beat of 2 men, neither of whom wanted to be seen leaving second. Then Ferraro stood, buttoned his jacket with 2 precise movements, and walked out with Luca behind him. The iron door swinging shut with a sound like something being locked away. Junie waited until their footsteps faded down the front of the building. "You gave him a corridor," he said. "I gave him a sentence to say to his men." Bumpy said, "That costs me a route I wasn't fully using. It buys me a border that holds without maintenance." He picked up his hat. "Cheap. What if it's not enough for him long term?" Bumpy looked at him. "Then he'll need to find men willing to come back to Harlem. And right now that's a harder conversation for him than it is for me." Outside, the November wind pushed down 132nd Street, cold and indifferent, carrying the smell of coal smoke and wet pavement, and the city doing what it always did, moving forward without commentary on what had just happened inside one of its back rooms. People who lived through this period note that conversations like this one left no paper trail by design. What's preserved exists because the participants described it years later to people who understood why it mattered. In that world, peace doesn't arrive when 2 men stop hating each other. It arrives when both men look across a table and see, with complete clarity, exactly how much they still have left to lose. The fire escape on the back of the building on 140th groaned when the wind hit it a low, metallic sound, like something in pain and too old to do anything about it. The room at the top of the stairs smelled of cold concrete, old wood, and the specific staleness of a space that had been closed for months and opened tonight for one purpose. A single work light on an extension cord threw yellow across the floor and left the corners in shadow. 4 crates along one wall, iron bolts in the ceiling from something that had been removed years ago. The kind of room a city produces in large quantities forgotten. Functional. Useful precisely because nobody official had thought about it in years. Eddie Cole stood in the middle of it. He was not tied. He was not held. He had walked up those stairs on his own legs, which was either dignity or its absence, depending on what you thought dignity required. The men who brought him there had not touched him, because touching wasn't necessary. There was nowhere he could go that wasn't worse than the room he was standing in. And Eddie knew the geography of that reality better than anyone. Bumpy sat on a crate 6 feet away. Junie stood against the wall to the left, 2 other men at the back, still as furniture, there to witness and remember. The wind hit the fire escape again. The groan moved through the wall. Bumpy looked at Eddie the way a man looks at wreckage, not with anger, not with grief, but with the specific attention of someone trying to understand exactly how the thing fell apart, so it never happens the same way again. "Tell it from the beginning," Bumpy said. "The real version, not the one you practiced on the way up here." Eddie started talking. It began 14 months ago with a gambling debt. Not enormous $8,000 accumulated over 6 months in a game he had no business being in. Borrowed at interest from a man connected to an operation that connected eventually, through 2 intermediaries, to Ferraro's people. He had been approached quietly. The terms clean and specific, regular information on routes, schedules, meeting locations. The debt disappeared. A small supplementary payment arrived monthly through a channel that moved too quietly to flag. He said yes because the alternative was a conversation with Bumpy about a debt that would expose 14 months of a separate life he had been living in the margins of the one everyone could see. He told himself the information was general, operational, not lethal, not the kind that got men killed. He was wrong. He knew he was wrong by the 4th month. He continued anyway. His voice held for the first 7 minutes and broke on the 8th. Not into crying, but into something flatter and more final, the voice of a man who has stopped managing how he sounds because the management no longer serves any purpose. Junie stood completely still against the wall. His face was a closed door with something very heavy pressing against it from the other side. Then Bumpy said, "Who else had access to the same information before Ferraro paid for it?" Eddie closed his eyes, kept them closed for 3 seconds. 2 others, before him. They approached through different channels. Neither of them met the price. The room absorbed that. 2 others, before Ferraro. Meaning Ferraro was not the origin of the threat. He was the conclusion of a market that had been operating for over a year. Testing the purchase price of Bumpy Johnson's vulnerability through a man who sat at his table, ate his food, and had been trusted with the specific operational knowledge that kept other men alive. Bumpy stood up from the crate. He walked to the window and looked down at the street, the lit windows across the block. A car moving slowly through the intersection, Harlem continuing below as it always continued, indifferent to what happened above it in dark rooms. He turned back. 7 years, he said. You sat at my table for 7 years. You were in my house. You knew which car I used on which nights and why I varied the routes and when the cash moved and who was carrying it. You held that. He paused. And you sold it for a debt you could have brought to me in the first week. Eddie said nothing. Was it ever about more than the money? Bumpy said, not aggressive. Actually asking. Eddie looked at the floor. His voice came out quiet and stripped of everything except the truth, which was the only thing left that had any weight. At the end, it wasn't about money at all. That answer was honest. It made the betrayal complete in a way that a purely financial motive would not have. It meant the grievance had been carried for a long time before the debt gave it a vehicle. It meant the debt was the door, not the reason. Bumpy nodded once. Very slowly. What happened next in that room is not something that was written down, because the men present understood that some things are preserved more safely in memory than in record, and that memory, held by the right people, is more durable than paper. Accounts of moments like this one survived because the people who witnessed them chose carefully, over the years, what to pass forward, and to whom the written record of Harlem's underground was always thinner than the lived one. A traitor doesn't die when he's caught. He dies the moment he decides his loyalty has a price. Everything that follows is just the city collecting what it's owed. The last Saturday of November smelled like coal smoke, cold grease, and the specific sharpness of winter air that has finally committed to staying. Bumpy walked out of the Lenox at 7 in the evening without a destination, which was unusual enough that Junie started to follow him and then stopped. Reading the quality of the walk correctly, this was not a public appearance. This was not a performance. This was a man moving through something private at street level, because the alternative was sitting still with it, and sitting still with it was not something the body could sustain past a certain point. He walked south on Lenox with his hands in his coat pockets and the wind pushing against him. Past the barber shop that had been on that corner since before the war. Past the church steps where Father Owens had told him about the man asking questions about parking. Past the diner where May had told him the neighborhood thought he'd gone to ground. 3 weeks compressed into 4 blocks, the whole arc of it present in the geography. He stopped at Elise's laundromat on 131st. She was still at her table. Ledger closed now, coffee made. She poured him a cup without asking, and he sat down across from her and they were quiet for a moment. The way 2 people are quiet when the work is done, and what remains is the weight of it. The Maratha channel is dead, he said, permanently. Elise nodded. She already knew. She had probably known for 2 days. What you found in those receipts, he said, that's what made the difference. She looked at him with the steady, unsentimental gaze of a woman who had been doing necessary work for 30 years and had learned not to require acknowledgement for it. Go home. Bumpy, she said, not unkindly. May found him at 8 outside the club on 133rd. She fell into step beside him without announcement, which was how May operated. She appeared where she was needed, with the timing of someone who had been paying close attention. The story is set, she said. The neighborhood has the version it needs. Ferraro got a corridor and a face-saving announcement. The 6 men are a ghost story. Nobody official is going to pursue. She paused. It holds. Until it doesn't, Bumpy said. It holds long enough, she said firmly. Then, quieter. You're different tonight. He didn't answer that. Some things didn't become clearer by being described. The restructuring of the network took the next 14 days. Junie ran it with the focused intensity of a man working through something personal by way of something practical. 12 positions closed and rebuilt, routes rerouted, access points that Eddie had touched replaced entirely with systems that carried none of his fingerprints. The new people were younger, known to fewer people outside the immediate organization, and briefed explicitly on exactly one thing. Reliability was the only currency that spent cleanly in this network, and the cost of spending anything else had just been demonstrated at full volume. Ferraro held his side through December. The corridor announcement ran through Sal as agreed, framed as a business expansion, both names attached with equal weight. Whether Ferraro's men believed the framing didn't change the practical reality, which was that the border held and the terms were honored, and not a single person connected to Ferraro's organization set foot in Harlem for anything except transit. The bullet was still on the table in the back room of the Lenox. Bumpy had left it there through the entire 3 weeks, through the dinner with Sal, through the walk at the Savoy, through the identification of Eddie and the construction of the trap, and the night the 6 men vanished, and the 51 minutes in the tailor shop and the room on 141st, and everything that followed. He had left it there because it was the origin point of the whole sequence, and he had not yet decided what it meant to him now that the sequence was complete. He sat down at the table alone on the last night of November and looked at it. It was just a bullet. Polished brass, sitting on the table in a back room in Harlem. The velvet was gone, somebody had thrown it away without asking. Which was correct. Just the bullet itself, small and cold and utterly indifferent to what it had set in motion. He picked it up, turned it once between his fingers, set it back down. He was 40 years old. He had built something real and defended it, and it was still standing. The men who had tried to take it were either gone or repositioned behind a border that would hold as long as both sides remembered the lesson of the last 3 weeks clearly enough. What had changed was internal and permanent. The specific quality of trust, the warmth that used to exist underneath the authority. The feeling that the network was something more than a business arrangement between people who needed each other, that was gone. Not destroyed in rage, not lost in a single moment. Just quietly concluded. The way a fire concludes when the last thing feeding it burns through and there is nothing left to combust. He would run this neighborhood with the same presence, the same force, the same absolute clarity about who held what and why. But he would run it colder. And colder, in this city, in this life, was not weakness. Colder was the only honest response to what the last 3 weeks had taught him. The full story of this period was never written down in any form. Meant to last, it survived, because the people who lived it understood that memory, kept carefully and passed forward deliberately, outlasts any document. The winner is not the man who survives the ambush. It is the man who converts the ambush into the new law of the city, enforced without announcement, permanent without paper, written in the one language this city has always understood best. The old order didn't end with gunfire or headlines. It ended with empty cars, locked money routes, and 6 names. Nobody in any official record ever claimed. Harlem didn't become peaceful after that. It became owned. Ferraro kept his corridor and his face. Bumpy kept his throne and paid for it with the last warm thing inside him, whatever remained of the belief that the men closest to you couldn't be purchased. The bullet stayed on the table. Nobody threw it away. Nobody asked why. Some men survive because they shoot first. Bumpy Johnson survived because he understood something colder and more permanent than that the most dangerous weapon in any city is knowing exactly who around you has already decided to betray you and saying nothing. If this story stayed with you, you already understand why Harlem remembered it for decades. Subscribe because the next story is darker, the stakes are higher, and the man in the room makes a decision that changes everything. Was Bumpy right to keep Eddie alive long enough to use him, or did loyalty deserve a faster answer? And in that world, is silence ever truly mercy, or just a slower blade? Drop your answer below. The people who lived this asked the same question,